Hi guys, I want to give you some points on Chapter 3, studying and reviewing Chapter 3 in the Bio 109 course. This chapter is, let me just adjust that, is a humongous chapter. In fact, usually the topics that are covered in this chapter are split up between two chapters, but for some reason your textbook editor wanted to cram it all into one chapter, so we get the joy of trying to hash it out in just 1 week on top of all of the other things that you have to do. So I'm going to try to give you some study strategies and help you kind of waft your way through Chapter 3, which is a pretty rough chapter, especially if you don't have any biology background. For those of you that have some bio background, you'll find the first part of this chapter on the basic organelles and cell parts. You'll find that a basic review. This is this, that is that. In lab, you may be tested on the parts of the cell, where they are, what they look like, etc. In lecture, on this online portion of lecture, you will only be tested multiple choice style or essay style. Maybe a few true-false sprinkled in there, but there will never be diagrams on your Blackboard versions of the test. Now, if some of you need to take makeup tests, there may be a diagram or two from the textbook or from other sources that you'll have to label. But for those of you that are going in to take the Blackboard version of the exams when they're due, you will not find any diagrams. So just keep that in mind in terms of how you're studying. Along with how you're studying, I'm just going to flip through this chapter and point out certain page numbers and diagrams and items that will be of assistance to you as you're studying. The first big diagram is on page 50 to 51. It's a big old picture of an animal cell. It goes through all of the organelles, labels them for you, as well as tells you the structure. I strongly suggest going through, making note cards of these items and studying them that way, especially if this is new to you. There's more words in this class than in a foreign language, so it's really important that you are taking the time to involve yourself in the vocabulary. The vocabulary will kill you in this class if you don't keep up with it. It is very important. A couple of you made the suggestions in the discussion area to use note cards. That's a perfectly great idea. I suggest using just a plain old sheet of paper. Take the sheet of paper and have 3 columns across it. Notice I don't have my cast on today. 3 columns. One column is for the word, one column is for the definition, and one column can be for an example or a picture or a metaphor or something that's going to help you remember that term. And then what you can do is you can fold your paper in 3 columns like that. And now you have a great study tool. You can study from it this way, or this way, or this way, all of the different ways. And that way you can fit lots and lots of terms down the side instead of just having 1 word per note card. Just an idea to help you. Everyone has their own little ways of studying, so that's just one suggestion. And I'll try to plug a couple of those study tricks into the course as we go. The next super important thing to understand is how the plasma membrane is put together, and that's covered on page 52. There's a great diagram there. There's proteins involved, there's carbohydrates involved, there's lipids involved, so that's pulling some of the important stuff from Chapter 2 into the cell. So it's really important that you understand the basics of Chapter 2 to understand the basics of a cell before we get into the next part, which is understanding how the tissues are put together. So I strongly encourage you to understand how that cell membrane works. Along with how the cell membrane works, we're going to get into, once you get past all the organelles, you get through the idea of membrane transport and how things are transported through the membrane or across the membrane in some cases. And that's going to be diffusion, osmosis, simple diffusion, active transport, all of those ideas that are listed on page 59 and around that area. It involves transport proteins. In some cases it involves ion pumps. In some cases the molecules are just going to simply diffuse between the phospholipids. That's all dependent upon the size, the polarity of the actual molecule itself, and that's all explained in the text. Something important that's kind of a real-world application is covered on page 61. This is an actual description of what happens to a red blood cell when it's exposed to different situations. So when you go to the ER or to the doctors, whatever, and you're dehydrated, they don't just pump you full of distilled water, they're pumping you full of an isotonic solution, a saline solution, and that is for the reasons that you see on that chart right there on page 61. So please let me know if you have questions about that. The sodium-potassium pump is diagrammed out very well on page 62. That will come back to haunt you later in the semester when we do muscles, when we do nervous system. So it's extremely important to understand how the sodium-potassium pump works. Finally, the next section of this chapter gets into protein synthesis and how proteins are coded for by your DNA. That's very important. In fact, that's my passion. I'm a geneticist or a molecular biologist by nature. That doesn't mean I'm going to test you heavily on that subject. That just means I think it's important. But this section does not apply as much to the rest of the semester. So if there's anything to kind of fake it through or not spend too much time on, it would be this section here on transcription and translation. Now you will be tested on it just like you'll be tested on anything from this book, but don't stress over it too much if you don't quite get it, and if you don't get it, ask for help. Next you come up to the cell division part on mitosis and meiosis. This mitosis and meiosis section is very important in understanding how cells grow and reproduce. This is also going to play a role in sexual reproduction, which we'll cover in the very last chapter of the semester, chapter 16. There's a great diagram on page 68 and 69. What I would do with this, I would redraw it. Take a sheet of paper, diagram it out in your own writing, in your own words. Try paraphrasing some of the captions there for each picture, and try to recreate the picture itself. When you're recreating the picture, what you're doing is your brain has to think about how to draw it, how to make it, how to draw this line this way or that way, and it's working a totally different section of your brain than just if you stare at it and read it. So I strongly suggest recreating that diagram, especially if you're having trouble understanding mitosis or meiosis. And there's a great chart comparing the two processes on page 70. Finally, the second section of this chapter is all about tissues. You will see, if you've looked ahead at the possible essays for this unit exam that's coming up in a few weeks, one of your possible essays deals with epithelial tissue and examples of epithelial tissue in the body. I suggest doing the same method that I suggested before with the columns. One column, this is going to be listing your tissues. You have simple squamous epithelium, stratified squamous epithelium, simple cuboidal, etc., and then you'd have where they're located in the body, and then maybe a drawing of them and what they look like in that third column. So you could match them up in a lab identification if your lab instructor is going to have you do that. Just a suggestion, but the tissues are very intense and there's a lot of them, so I strongly suggest getting a good handle on them early on in the week, maybe tomorrow, starting to dive into that tissue section. There's some great pictures of connective tissue and all the components of connective tissue on pages 76 and 77. Cartilage is grouped in there with all of the connective tissues, and you have the muscular tissue and your 3 types of muscular tissue. You'll be looking at all of those in lab, and then finally the nervous tissue to end out this chapter. So please let me know if you have any questions. I plan on having a little chapter walk, so to speak, for you for every chapter. That way you can keep a hold on what's going on from chapter to chapter. I hope this was helpful. Take care and keep up the hard work. Bye.